Okay, this is reading commentary on the Georges Lefebvre reading for History 321, the French Revolution. This reading is for Thursday, April 30th. So, Lefebvre is a Marxist. Okay, so his basic understanding of the French Revolution is that all of the conflict in the French Revolution was driven by class conflict. Different classes had different economic interests, and they're fighting over power. Okay, so he tries to interpret everything through that lens of class conflict, right? And so he tends to slot people in and say this person represents this class or this person represents that class, right? And he also has a tendency to talk about the bourgeoisie doing this or the aristocracy doing that or the working class hating this or the peasantry being afraid of that. Right, so he kind of makes each class, he personifies it, and so makes it a single person who thinks as one. And so that's one thing. I mean, this can be really helpful because Marxist historians often can point to, I mean, there really is often class conflict underlying things. And we can often get caught up in the details and the sort of fluff of events and not realize that the thing driving those events, or one of the things driving those events, can be class conflict. And Marxists are really good at pointing that out. It's a really useful thing. But the criticism of Marxists is that they often try to shove, square pegs into round holes. They're trying to say this had to be class conflict, so we're going to shove everything in here as class conflict, and we're going to make everybody's motivations kind of simple. It's all class conflict, right? So, overall, what Lefebvre is doing, and I want to point out, Lefebvre is one of the major, maybe the preeminent historian of the French Revolution in the middle of the 20th century. What Lefebvre is doing here is he's looking at the early revolution. The reading I had you read is the early revolution. And I cut out some bits there because he goes on quite a bit and I didn't want to overload you. But essentially, he's talking about the events of 1789, right? The first events of the revolution. And so when he looks at the events, and the events he's looking at is, okay, the king basically realizes that he has no options for raising taxes, so he decides to call an Estates General, and then he calls the Estates General, and then the Third Estate refuses to play ball and declares themselves the National Assembly, and then Bastille Day happens, and the people of Paris storm the Bastille, and then the National Assembly abolishes feudal privileges, publishes the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and nationalizes the church. There's one other event I didn't mention before, and that is that in August of 1789, there was a massive wave of panic that swept across France. And I'll talk about this later. It's called the Great Fear. But there were all sorts of rumors swirling around that there were armies of brigands going around. They were going to burn down peasants' fields, or they were going to murder people, etc. And so there was a wave of violence, actually, of peasants sort of preemptively either attacking aristocrats in their houses, or putting together sort of militias to go patrol around for brigand armies, etc. This all happens in 1789, really in the summer of 1789. And Lefebvre, he's looking at all these events, and he's trying to make sense of it. He's like, well, what's really important here? What made this happen? What's driving this? And he decides that everything is driven by class conflict, because he's a Marxist. He decides that there's actually 4 social classes that are all pursuing their own self-interest here in 1789. And they're not working together. They're working at sort of cross purposes, but the effect of all of this is to drive the revolution forward. So he really sees this revolution in 1789 as being 4 separate revolutions that are happening all at once, because there's 4 different social classes that are trying to make things happen, and the net result is the revolution that happens. So the first one he sees is the aristocratic revolution. And basically what he says here is that from the 1600s into the 1700s, the French king, the monarchy, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, they had been expanding their power, and they had been taking power away from aristocrats. They had been expanding central government control over aristocrats. Okay, and they had done it in various ways, and I'll talk about this more in the future. But essentially, he argues that the king had been expanding his centralized government control at the expense of aristocrats who had generally been the most powerful people in their regions of France. And so the government starts pushing aristocrats aside and sort of taking away their power. And so Lefebvre argues that the aristocrats are the ones who are first fighting against the king. And it's not like they're openly fighting the king, but what they're doing is they're defending their privileges. They're refusing to let the king raise their taxes. They're telling him in no uncertain terms, you cannot do this. And so the aristocrats, by fighting back against the king, and they're fighting for their own class interests. They want to have power to control their own regions, etc. They don't want a strong king. And so they're trying to keep the king weak, Lefebvre says. And by doing that, they inadvertently start the French Revolution, because by refusing to allow the king to raise taxes on them and telling him they're going to fight him, they force the king to call the Estates General. Right? So Lefebvre argues that the king calling the Estates General, which is the thing that starts the whole French Revolution, really is part of an aristocratic class struggle against the king himself. All right? The aristocracy as a class is trying to hold on to some power, and they're trying to prevent the king from taking that power away from them. Now, you can, I know your first question is going to be, well, geez, isn't the king an aristocrat? And yes, he is. But Lefebvre says that the king, as the head of the government, has different interests than the aristocrats as a class. Okay, so the first revolution is the aristocrats forcing the king to call the Estates General. But once the Estates General starts, you get the second revolution, Lefebvre says, which is that the bourgeoisie stands up and realizes that, hey, this is a moment where the king is vulnerable and the aristocracy is vulnerable, and we can assert our own prerogatives and we can demand things here. Right? So basically, the bourgeoisie then stands up at the Estates General and says, no, we want a National Assembly, and we want a constitution, and we want all sorts of things like that. And basically, Lefebvre argues that this is the bourgeoisie realizing that they have a set of interests that they can push through the National Assembly, and a constitution is in their best interest because it takes away privileges from the aristocrats, and that allows the bourgeoisie to move up the social scale because it destroys the aristocrats' privileges that had kept the bourgeoisie down before. And so the second revolution is basically the tennis court oath and the calls for a National Assembly, and then essentially the National Assembly, once it's in session, passing the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, abolishing feudal privileges, and nationalizing the church. Those, Lefebvre says, are all bourgeois interests. So Lefebvre says what he's seeing here is a bourgeois revolution. Okay? But Lefebvre says the bourgeoisie can't do it alone. The bourgeoisie, the leaders of the bourgeoisie in the National Assembly would have just been arrested by the king if they hadn't been protected by the people of Paris. And so the third group that Lefebvre sees working here is the people, the lower classes of Paris. And I talked about these in the lecture for today. These are the working class people of Paris, the journeymen and the craftsmen making shoes and stuff for wages. The porters and the stall, the people selling vegetables out of stalls, and the laundresses and the etc. All the poor working class people of Paris. This is not the bourgeoisie. This is the poor. But they're in Paris, so they're not peasants either. They're not farmers. So the working poor, urban working class. And Lefebvre says that they also realize that this is a moment they can demand things. And so when they're the ones, he says, who storm the Bastille and take the weapons. And that's a revolutionary moment where the working class stands up and says, hey, we want to be part of this too. We've got an interest here. We've got things we want to have happen. So essentially, the working class carrying out their revolution of taking control of Paris actually helps the bourgeoisie, who is in the National Assembly, because it protects them. Once the working class has stormed the Bastille and taken weapons, the king realizes he cannot arrest the National Assembly because Paris will revolt against him. So Lefebvre is arguing that there's two social classes here that each have their own agenda, and they're essentially working together to push this revolution forward. And by this time, the aristocracy is opposed to the revolution. They're like, no, we wanted to just prevent the king from getting power. We didn't want to destroy the king. We don't want all this. So each class has its own interest. And then finally, Lefebvre says there's a fourth class, which is the peasantry. And the peasants are really not involved in any of this. They're not following the national, no peasants get elected to the National Assembly or the Third Estate. None of them are in the National Assembly. Peasants don't read much, so they're not following this. They're really just not very up on it. But when the Great Fear spreads across France in August, when there are rumors that aristocrats are going to punish the peasants because they lost at the Estates General, and when there's rumors that there are brigand armies running around, the peasants rise up and they actually attack aristocrats, and they burn down aristocratic chateaus, and they murder some aristocrats, and they destroy the records that aristocrats use to say what seigneurial dues each peasant owes. And so Lefebvre says that's another class that gets involved in the process. The peasants jump in. And he says the peasants have their own interests. They're really interested in destroying seigneurial dues. And then once the bourgeoisie gets rid of all seigneurial feudal privileges, including seigneurial dues, the peasantry is like, okay, we're done. We don't care anymore, right? We got what we wanted, right? So basically what Lefebvre is saying here is in the early part of the revolution, there's really 4 different social classes in France, and each of them has their own set of interests. And sometimes those interests coincide, and then those classes work together to get what they want, but sometimes they don't coincide and they start to work it differently. And so what Lefebvre is saying then is if you want to understand what's really going on in the French Revolution, you have to understand economically what each class wants, where each class stands, how they make their money, who they're dependent on, what they'd like to change, and then watch what they do, because they're really acting in their own economic best interest at every step of the road. And what's happening here is that there's the complex interaction of 4 different social classes, each trying to get what they want. And it leads to all sorts of unintended outcomes that produce the French Revolution. So this is Lefebvre's early reading of the Revolution, is that it started by the aristocracy because they're trying to hold back the power of the king. But that inadvertently sets off the bourgeois revolution, which then sparks the popular revolution, which finally sparks the peasant revolution. And each of those 3 groups, the bourgeoisie, the working classes, and the peasants, are all have their own interests, their own things they want, their own things they want to accomplish, and they're all willing to use violence or protest or political power to do it. And so that is what sets the French Revolution going. But what Lefebvre is going to watch for down the road is that at some point, the interests of the bourgeoisie, the working classes, and the peasants start to diverge, and they want different things. And in fact, after a little while, the bourgeoisie wants to solidify its control of France, and it doesn't want the working class and the peasants to be uppity anymore. So it now starts to fight against them, and when that happens, you get the terror. Okay, so this is Lefebvre's reading of this. And as you're reading it, I want you to be thinking about several things, because the language Lefebvre uses really tells you what he's thinking about, right? Look at how many times Lefebvre uses the bourgeoisie wanted or did or etc., or the aristocracy wanted or did or whatever. Look at how he does it. He turns social classes into sort of people who uniformly want one thing. It's like the class as a whole thinks one thing. Watch for that, because that's a real symbol or a sign that he thinks in terms of social classes. Social classes are coherent things to him. Second, and this is a little harder to see, think about how much he assumes that every social class has an agenda. They want something, and that all of them know what they want. Right? So the aristocracy not only has the interest of reigning in the power of the king, but they all know it, and they all agree on it without even talking about it. Or the bourgeoisie has a set of interests, and they understand that they are a class, and they have a set of interests. So Lefebvre is sort of assuming this. I want you to watch how it plays out, that he's really assuming not just that the class has an interest, but that they know they have an interest, that they understand that they are a group, they are a club, they are a team, right? He seems to assume that. And I want you to watch that and ask yourself, does that seem reasonable? Does that seem like he could really assume that in real life, or is it different? Right? And the last thing I want you to think about with this is, Well, I want you to ask yourself, who are the people? He mentions a lot of people by name, right? He mentions a lot of people by name, and you're not going to know these names, but a lot of them have titles in front of them, like the Marquis de Condorcet or the Marquis de Lafayette, etc. Those are aristocratic titles. Those people are aristocrats. But watch who's doing what, and ask yourself, are these names, which are often aristocratic, lining up with the social classes they're supposed to be representing? And if not, how does Lefebvre explain that? Right? Because he does point out that oftentimes the people representing the interest of, say, the bourgeoisie are not bourgeois, they're aristocrats. How does he explain that? Right? So I want you to keep looking at that also. And so as you read Lefebvre, I want you to see that Lefebvre is just assuming there are social classes here. That social classes are acting, that they know what they want, and that they all agree on what they want, and that they're willing to act on that. And that they have a coherent identity. They know which class they belong to. And then I want you to think about, does that really line up with what's happening? And then finally, I want you to say, does the actual details of this person said this and did this, does that line up with the social classes he's talking about? All right, and we're going to see, other, at the moment, he might seem, this might seem perfectly reasonable, but when you read, Furet or something else, you might go, oh, well, that's a different perspective. And then you have to weigh the two and decide which one looks better. Now, Marxism has been really popular for history because it sort of offers an easy way to say, well, let's look at that and see if that's important. And often social class is important. Marxists are definitely on to something. But the criticisms of Marxism are that they often oversimplify things and they sort of cram people into boxes and say you're bourgeois and you're aristocratic and whatever, when it might not work that way. It might be more complicated. So pay attention to how Lefebvre uses class. Pay attention to who he thinks represents which class. Pay attention to how what sorts of assumptions he's making about those classes. And then we'll compare that to Furet and then Tackett, etc., later on in the course. So keep this in mind while you're reading Lefebvre.